Previously on agentpalmer.com, Len Deighton's City of Gold is must-read World War II fiction. Travelin Band documentary reminds us just how great CCR is, and if you've heard the last episode and you know a teacher, thank a teacher. This is the Palmer Files, episode 82, with author Jimmy Soni, co-author of A Mind at Play about Claude Shannon, and author of The Founders about the founding of PayPal and the evolution of the PayPal Mafia. We discuss the process of creating those books, researching, method writing, going dark, plus the creative process in all its forms, the good and bad, the early mornings and late nights, and much, much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 82nd episode is Jimmy Soni, who is an author I have not only read, he is an author I have connected with and spoken to on occasion since we met through his first book. The two books of his I have read and that I do mention are A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Internet Age, and The Founders, The Story of PayPal and the Entrepreneurs Who Shaped Silicon Valley. If you are interested in the history of the internet or technology, finance, or the device you are listening to me on, then at least one of these books should be of interest to you. But that isn't all we talk about. It is where you will hear this conversation start, but we really dig in deep into the processes with which Jimmy uses to research, write, and create these books. We also talk on a more general level about the creative process. Things like how the ambition and willingness to put something out there should be more celebrated. The process of creation is just as much of a dopamine hit as the finished product, advice for writers and others looking to create something, the chaos of publishing, balance, and well, all of that and a whole lot more is coming your way shortly. But first, if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Jimmy Soni at Jimmy A. Soni, that's JIMMYASONI, and this show at The Palmer Files. You can find more information about Jimmy at jimmysoni.com, that's SONI, where you can not only find links to all of his published works, you can see some of his essays and talks there as well. Don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings, including reviews for both The Founders and A Mind at Play on agentpalmer.com, and of course email can be sent to thepalmerfiles at gmail.com. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jimmy, I've read two of your books. You've written more than that, but I've read two of your books, and I wanted to ask you, the first book about Claude Shannon is about someone who is deceased, and the second one that I read features the founders of PayPal, called The Founders, and they're very much alive. Did it feel any different writing about a quote-unquote historical figure that was very much in the past when you were writing about it versus people that are alive and still doing things?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it couldn't have been more different. And I'll just say, like, dead people are so much easier to write about. Like, it's, in every way, I'm not obviously like I'm glad that the subjects I wrote about for PayPal are alive. But it's way easier to write about dead people. No, I'm joking, but I'm joking because it's the truth.
Okay.
And the truth is that, how do I put this? You know, if I got something wrong about Claude Shannon, he doesn't have 100 million Twitter followers that he could deploy like a drone missile.
Okay.
Right. But in all seriousness, like, the stakes are lower. And that, by the way, it's not a, we didn't skimp on the research for that book. Like, my co-author, Rob Goodman, and I really went for broke. We talked to a lot of people. We interviewed tons of people, went through the archives of the Library of Congress, went and visited his gravestone, all of the things. But, Shannon wasn't going to be around to correct the record. Whereas with the people that I was writing about, not only am I writing about people who are alive, but I'm writing about people who are very, as somebody put it to me, like in something that they wrote to me, they're assiduous guardians of their public image. right?
Yeah.
And they are, and like they're very. When someone says something about them that is false, these people will take to Twitter and correct the record, right? And so I had this extra threshold to overcome when I was writing about these subjects, because they wasn't just that they were living, it was that they were living and public figures, some of them, not all of them, but many of them. And so that was, it was a very different experience. I think the other thing is I felt an added burden to be careful, like to be extra careful, to dot I's, to cross T's, to hire a fact checker, to go back over every scrap, to look at emails that were from that era. Because I also recognized, that when you're talking to people about things that happened 20 years ago, you're sort of fighting against memory. You're fighting against like the way that the mind kind of like overwrites certain information and forgets other information.
Yeah.
And so I had this challenge of, I would hear something and I'd have to just go and kick the tires on it, or I would talk to somebody and they would lead me to something and it would turn out that that didn't happen that way. So I think I see it as actually like very different processes. The one thing that carries over that was important is, I approached, one could say that like one of the tools in the toolkit for doing the PayPal book was historical research with primary source documents, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of just going through thousands of emails, right? Like thousands and thousands of emails is part of what historical work involves, like looking back at the record as close as you can get to the era in which the events happened and then making heads or tails of them. And so I think, there's definitely like some commonalities, but writing about the living is vastly harder than writing about the dead.
So when it comes to that extra layer of like protection, right? When you're talking about getting the facts right, is that, and I'm not trying to make it so binary, but is it more on the editing, the after the fact, or is it more on the research? Like because obviously the final catches happen in the editing, but there's that amount of research which gets you to wherever you are. Is it on both, do you just feel the weight on both sides, or does it fall like, oh, the editing is so much more?
No, you feel the weight on both sides. And I'll tell you why, because the what is a fact, what is an opinion, and what happened questions are the questions that you want to ask these people live when you're interviewing them, right? Okay. And so you can't escape it on the gathering string end, on the end where you're actually just like accumulating the information that you'll take to shape the book. I had to ask, for example, Elon about the moment that he was pushed out of the company. But I had to ask him that, like, kind of full well knowing that it wasn't his proudest moment and that he might throw me out of the interview, like as I'm asking him about it. But I wouldn't have been doing justice to the work if I hadn't asked that question. And so there is stuff that happens on the front end. It shapes that part of the process. But as you said, most of the work actually happens on the back end. And a lot of it, what it really comes down to is, at least in the way that I do my work, you are citing all of the quotes and citing all the sources. And so if you flip back to the section that nobody will read, right? I have about 100 pages of endnotes at the very end of the Founders. And I cite, every quote. In some cases where a subject might have repeated themselves, I cite multiple sources. And what you try to do is at the very end is like a stress test, right? To sort of borrow the like finance language, or at least like the finance language that they adapted after the financial crisis. You are stress testing your text and you are looking at like, okay, did I get this quote exactly right? And part of what I had in that effort, just to get into the weeds a bit on this, because I think it's interesting and I think readers ought to know, or listeners ought to know, how these books come to be. Publishers don't have fact checkers. They don't hire fact checkers. That comes out of an author's pocket. So I found, I've never worked with a fact checker before, but he came, his reputation preceded him, and he came recommended through a friend. His name was Ben Kalin. And Ben has been a fact checker for, 2 decades. And he is so aggressive and so smart. And he has the most thankless job in the world, which is he has to tell authors, well, you got this wrong, and you got this wrong, and you got this wrong, and you got this wrong. And he didn't say that. And this is 1998, but it actually happened you said this happened in 1998, but it actually happened in 1996. And so he essentially has a job of like beating you up for chapter after chapter after chapter. But Ben was a godsend because Ben caught all of these things that, again, were in some cases unintentional errors, or just kind of like somebody had said something one place, but there were three other sources that said it happened somewhere else. And so I was able to go through that process with him multiple times. So actually, Ben went through the draft several times. And then at the same time, I was going through it and making sure, okay, does this line up with this? Does this line up with this? And a book like this is never going to it's never going to be perfect, right? I mean, there's no actually it's always going to be an asymptotic limit that you're trying to hit. But I tried to be very rigorous about the use of my sources, the use of quotes, everything from like who is saying the quote to what's the context to when was it said. I always tried to like get information and insights that happened as close to the events that I was writing about as possible. And so it's just a long way of saying like, every part of what I described in terms of like writing about the living and some of the anxieties and how do you balance it, it happens from the beginning when you're interviewing all the way through the fact checking. But if you had to do the split, it's probably 40% during the interviewing and 60% in the end and the fine tuning and the checking of notes and citations. Now, it may have been a longer answer than you wanted.
No. Because it's interesting because I read a lot. I'd say about 50% of the things I read are nonfiction. And most of them that aren't biography are 100% history, right? So I'm in that kind of vein of like reading stuff. And, I kind of remember how I ended up with your first book. I got an email because either you or Rob or someone had read one of my other internet history book reviews. And I there's a part of me that wants to say it was a review of Hackers by, I think, Levy.
I think that might have been it. Or it was, if you had read The Information by James Glick or The Idea Factory by John Gertner, we may have reached, there's a small subset of people who are reading books about Claude Shannon or related figures and then writing about it. So we did our best to reach out to whoever we could. And, I think of it as fantastic in some ways because we were able to connect, and you're somebody who you're predisposed to want to read about Claude Shannon. So.
Well, that's true. And I bring it up because we had a relation. We kind of started a small email relationship back then.
Yeah.
I think after I posted my review and I tried to help as much as I could because when I like a book, I do that. I kind of reached out to you, and I remember at a certain point you were like, "Oh, I'm researching the PayPal mafia," and then like you went dark, and I presume it was just because you were buried in so much stuff. Because the thing that astounds me about you're taking on the story of PayPal is that it happened in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. So if the stock goes up, there's about 5 what you would call authoritative journals or newspapers that are going to write about that stock jump up or down. And so now all of a sudden, if it's in the history of the book and the story that you want to tell, you almost have to read all 5 of those things.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. So I'll just riff on a couple of the things you said because it's really funny. So you described this sort of, and then you went dark, right? Which is like if you were to interview all my friends, like they experienced that the same way, right? Like about 5.5 years ago, I ghosted the world, right? Like it's not. My thing about the pandemic was like everybody just caught up to the way I was living. I was quarantining before it was cool, right? I was just quarantining with PayPal. But the truth is I did go dark, and like it's this interesting thing. I think all writers have a very different approach, a very different process. But for me, one of my friends lovingly describes my process as method writing. She's like, you're like a method actor, but you're like a method writer where you have to like inhabit the book like fully and you have no other life for a while. And your friends have sort of come to tolerate this about you. But it is, I don't know why it works for me, but it does. I spent basically 7 days a week working on PayPal for several years. And it was every morning, it was Thanksgivings, it was Christmases. I mean, it was everything. It became the totality of my life. It sort of became like the sun in the center of the solar system and everything else kind of orbited around it.
Yeah.
And I think there's a few reasons. One is just time. You sort of have to put in the time to make a book of this length, right? And to deal with subjects who are in the news as often as some of these people are. Multiple of the people I wrote about took companies public during the time that I was writing about them, right? That's part of it. The second is, when you spend that amount of time, you come up with insights and angles that haven't been done before. There's a very easy, call it like a clip job way of doing the PayPal book, where you just kind of take everything that's already been written and you just kind of stitch it together and then you put it out in the world. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to add new knowledge, right? And so the problem is that doing that actually takes time. I remember there's this moment when Max is in the story begins with Max Levchin and he's in Ukraine. And I start the story with Chernobyl for reasons that readers will appreciate. But I went on it must have been like a 2-week thing, just understanding Chernobyl, right? And really reading papers from that era, trying to get my head around it. I did maps of where he lived relative to Chernobyl. And then I would kind of calculate distances. And then I would sort of, convert from kilometers to miles and whatnot. And so I had this thing of, I did go dark, and it's very funny that you described it that way, because I've had multiple just friends of mine say, well, you emerged from, your book cave. But I think of that as a big part for me of the way that I bring the story to life. So the benefit for readers is they will know that I was obsessed, right? And I have this, I'm going to talk for a second about, there are people I know who operate this way, who write this way. Laura Hillenbrand, who wrote the book, book people may know as Seabiscuit. She did a book called Unbroken. She has, I guess, I don't know if it's still referred to this way, but at the time that she was writing about it, it's referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS. And because she has CFS, she is frequently bedridden for I don't know her current state, but was bedridden during the writing of those books for long periods of time. But what she had enough energy to do was just read newspapers that were accounts of things happening in the period that she was writing about, right?
Okay,
the war years or the Seabiscuit years. And she became there's some piece of writing she did where she talked about she basically, because she only had enough energy to do that, she was inhabiting that era all the time. And there are World War II pilots who have read her description of planes in Unbroken and said, yeah, she nailed it, right? And so do I think this is a healthy way to live a life? Probably not. It's the reason I take a decent amount of time between book projects. But I spent every day of the last several years, I printed out this long blog from the 90s. I don't even remember what the name of it is, but it would basically link to interesting internet trivia from 1995 to 1999. And I would kind of start my day by reading that. And just to kind of get a feel for, slow internet connections, Y2K as a looming threat,
well,
right?
See, it's funny. Yeah. I understand that on such a level, because it's and I haven't done a lot of movie reviews of late. I used to probably do a lot more than I do now. And one of the reasons is, first of all, there's a lot coming out, and not necessarily all of some of it's enjoyable, but not all of it's worth writing about. But I was writing about older movies, and while it's not the same, I'm trying to review them as they were. It's really hard to take a movie that was made in 1985, any movie in 1985, and go, well, it doesn't hold up to movies of the 90s and early aughts. Well, of course not. But if you're reviewing it that way, no one's going to go back and view it as a classic or whatever it is. Right. So, I did a review of War Games, which is one of my favorites, and it's a classic. And it was hard for me to write it. I watched that movie 3 times over the course of 4 years with the intention to write about it. And then you sit down and you go, yeah, I'm not there. You have to get in that headspace, because it's not fair, not only to the people that are coming to it fresh, but the people that remember it in that way. And so you have to get in that headspace, because not everything, as more things come out and you consume more things, those things aren't fair to the reviews or the story as a whole.
Yeah, it's funny you say this. One of the things I told my friends is, don't tell me anything that's going on in the news about the people I'm writing about unless it's like insane, like they died, right?
Yeah.
But sort of, I created a little bit of a firewall to block out, 2020 and 2021 and 2022 Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Max Levchin or David Sachs, because that I can't have that pollute my understanding of who these people were when they were working between 1998 and 2002 to build the company that became PayPal. And I had a very hard time doing that. I mean, at one point, someone was like, "Oh, Elon's on SNL," and I was like, "Don't show! I don't want to know anything. I cannot. Like, it's not gonna work." And I did this section at the end of the book called it was like a note on sources and methods or something, and I point out at the very beginning that the most valuable stuff was not spending time with these people. The most valuable stuff was that there's this website that Stanford has kept called the eCorner. And the eCorner has old videos of Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, and Elon Musk from 2003 and 2004. And it's Peter and Max giving one presentation and Elon giving another. And they're just talking to students. They're not rich and famous. I mean, I think they were wealthy, but they weren't famous, right? They're not the people that we know them as today. They're sort of, you can just tell this is not the stage at TechCrunch in 2020. This is like a bunch of Stanford students in front of a classroom. But those were pay dirt, right? Those videos, because they were closer to the action. They were less polished. And I was always fighting against this tendency to look at everything that happened from 2002 to 2022 and like have that inform the writing. And to be fair, like some of it was during that period and like it was reasonably important, but it is the hardest thing, I think, for a lot of contemporary people who write history to just like actually wall yourself off, right? Not be active on Twitter, not be getting every update, and to actually sort of immerse yourself in the era that you're writing about.
When you go back to the Claude Shannon era, because obviously stuff's not so widely, Bell Labs was fairly good, I think, at documenting things, but you only have one source, right? Like, and so was it, how was that by comparison?
You'd be surprised. I would say that, it's a great question. The Claude Shannon work, you have primary source documents that are written in his own hand that are at the Library of Congress, right? So you have letters and you have notes and you have marginalia in books and you have various things he's built. You have things in museums. I also did have access to his family. So I had access to his children, his late wife. And I had people who were his collaborators and colleagues and like various correspondents who had very vivid memories of their interactions with him. And it also kept journals and notes and documents and things. I also, he was famous enough to be interviewed, and some of the audio and the video from those interviews was captured. And so I remember once actually stumbling on this like long lost audio recording and it was just being like the greatest day ever as a researcher, right? But there were things available that could put me back in the mind of a scientist working in the 20th century in that era. And then I made a point to also visit the places that he lived. So we visited, his home in Winchester. We visited MIT, visited Ann Arbor, and Gaylord, Michigan. And so we sort of stitched together the life that way as well. Much harder. And like, you're never going to get it again. You're never going to get it quite right. But I think the point is, I often sort of talk about these books. You kind of like accept that if you're going to do this, you have these roommates who are like always with you. You have like essentially like a roommate that like lives with you all the time and is always talking to you. Right. And it's like weird. It's like Elon was your roommate for 5 years or whatever. Right. So it sort of makes you, it shapes you. But I think that the end result of that, and this is what I'll get to. This is sort of to bring the point to a close. The point is, I have heard from people who were not involved in the story, but who know all of the protagonists in the story. And what they've told me that they really enjoy about it is, like, as one person put it, like, oh, you definitely captured who they were, sort of good and bad, right? That what I was able to do, I think, and I hope, is capture at least a portrait in time of who these people are that was recognizable to the other people who know them, right? And I that's like, when I got that note, I just remember being overjoyed because it was really what I was going for in the like intense, obsessive, like, okay, let's like study Peter Thiel's chess games to see if there's anything to learn there. Okay, let's like do a full history of the McLaren car so I can understand like why did Elon buy this car for $1 million. Okay, let's like go look and see if there's like post Chernobyl photos like of of Ukraine that I can. It was in service of trying to get a portrait that, again, that even people who know them would say, yeah, this is like largely accurate.
Where does this all come from, though? Like, did you always want to be an author? Like, I feel like that has, because like everything we've just spoke about makes me feel like you wanted to be a researcher at some point because you've done all this massive research, and there's no way, 10-year-old Jimmy's like, I want to write a book and spend 7 years researching each of them, right? Like that doesn't, people want to, I want to write a book, just sit down and write. That's what they think. So like, where does all this start from?
It's a great question. It's like, any answer I give, I think is going to be kind of imperfect because everyone I know who does books or really does anything like your podcast too, like it's a welter of motives, right? You sort of like have, maybe there's like motives that occupy 20 to 40% of it. And then there's like another bucket.
And it changes based on when you ask how, I had a great day. I had a bad day. Yeah. This is working. This is not. Yeah. No, I mean.
And the story behind these things changes as you go along, right? And you really sometimes do need to tell yourself a story about it because it sustains the difficulty and the anxiety and everything else. What I would say is I grew up just loving books. Like it was like the thing that I did in my spare time was I was reading all the time.
Okay.
And so like I grew up, like I loved like the Encyclopedia Brown series. I loved like the Brian Jacques Mossflower, the Redwall series, Mossflower Matameo. I would read Garfield comics like an obsessive, like a crazy person. I loved like Peanuts. I mean, I would read anything I could get my hands on. And that was just a habit that stuck. And as time went on, I noticed that my interest gravitated to history. And I started to just also, that happened. And then I also just started to recognize like, wow, there are certain kinds of writing that are just such quality work that I'm very impressed by it. Meaning I was just drawn to quality writing. And then like the natural sort of like next step is, okay, maybe I could do this. I started to do a little bit of writing in my spare time. I wrote for school papers. I wrote for the yearbook. I did all that sort of like check the nerd list, right? And then when, and then I kind of had the good fortune of being able to do a book with a friend, Rob Goodman. And like one thing led to another. I would say that the intense obsessiveness, what I just described is sort of like passion, like it's just like interest in a subject.
Yeah.
I think the intensity and the obsessiveness, like it, and the depth of research is, I think, like it's going to sound a little weird, but I feel a sense of obligation to my subjects when I write about them and to like kind of people 100 years from now reading about them. So I have this like sense that like your subjects deserve like really good research, like meaning if you're going to have the chance to write about Elon Musk, like you really should go for broke. If you're going to have the chance to write about Claude Shannon or about Peter Thiel or about any of these people, you really should like try. Like there's some element of just like you should try. And then part of it is I think about books that I have read that have really moved me that were written from a long time ago. And I appreciate the rigor, right? So there's this book I'm looking at right now. It's called A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. It's a fantastic book. It's pretty short. It's like 200 some odd pages. It's an account of the sinking of the Titanic, right? So no great surprises here. We sort of know how that story ends. But what Walter Lord did is he found every single living survivor, at least as best as I could tell. He found every survivor he could and he interviewed them. But then he found like the people who built the ship and the maps and the this and the that. And what is a very tight account, you can tell, is just brimming with research. And he has so many observations and insights that he was able to do despite the sinking of the Titanic being one of the most widely covered events from that era. He's writing like, I think like 50 some odd years later and just does a magnificent job, right? And he used this sort of, it's like go for broke, talk to everybody who will talk to you. The books I enjoy most are the books where the author has done that.
Okay.
And And so for me, it's also about producing something that, like, when I read it, is giving me joy. And, I'll give you a small example to maybe illustrate the point, which is when I was doing the research on Elon, one of the things that I did is I went to the archives of the student newspaper of the first university he attended, which was in Canada. And I searched through an embarrassingly large number of student newspapers over the years, a significant number of years, for the word Musk. And the problem with optical character recognition for the word Musk is that the word music can pop up, MUS can pop up, a lot of variations can pop up. But I would just scroll day after day after day, and I would just press the arrow and look at the next, and look at the next, and look at the next. This is over, it was like days, maybe even weeks of this. I did the same thing for the archives at the University of Pennsylvania. The upshot of what I just described is that in the book, I managed to find the advertisement that Elon took out for the first business he ever built, which was called Musk Computer Consulting. And I could have run a little riff from the ad in the book. I also found a long-lost student government platform when he ran for and lost election to UPenn's student government. But in both cases, I found something out that was about his character that I was able to show readers. This is the person who is this Elon at age 19 and 21 or whatever it was. And so the thing about it is that you can imagine it's sort of like an Indiana Jones thrill when you find like the freaking student government platform that nobody has found, right? And you're just blown away by it. Like, it's like an amazing document. And I can't tell you that that's logical. It seems actually pretty illogical, the whole hunt I described. But I also don't want to underestimate, like, when I found that, I was so happy. Like, it was like a part of it that was just joyful. So there's a long way of saying, like, I can't tell you exactly where it comes from, because there's multiple motives. The motives to posterity, the motivation to make sure your subjects feel like you're doing a good job and that you feel like you're doing justice to your subjects. The sense of, like, just enjoyment I get from it, which sounds a little, crazy or whatever. But
well, it doesn't, because, like, I get to, for better or worse, I get my endorphin rush on a weekly basis, right? Like, I post a blog every week, and every 2 weeks I post a podcast. And that means that 6 times a month I get to say I'm done with a project. Not every 7 years.
Right.
6 times a month I get to go, I did that. Like, boom, done, right? And so I get that. On a smaller, more consistent basis, I get that. I don't necessarily get the big wins. I think what you're describing in the victories in research, as well as the victory in, publishing or the first draft being complete, like, that's something too.
Right.
But I get that, because we're trying to put something back out there. And I think it comes up on this show quite a bit, because I feel like probably because I manifest it, but, like, we're never going to be 50-50 input and output, because we all consume too much.
Yes.
But at the same time, we're trying. Like, some of us are making an attempt to put something else out. We're not just bottomless holes consuming something. We're still taking the time to put something else out there. And that's maybe it's a character thing. I don't know. But, like, there's some of us that are trying the other way. We're not just consuming.
I know. Look, preach. Like, that's like it's a big. I don't know that I consciously think about that, because this is kind of what I do, but I totally agree with you. And the days I felt great were days that I produced the writing, and I would say my consumption of media was at a minimum during the times I was producing media, if that makes sense. Like,
sure.
So I agree with you. I think that the ambition to create anything and the willingness to put it out there, right, and make it substantive and make it of high quality, like, that's something we should nurture. It's something we should celebrate. And I suspect that, like, that you're right, that we're all kind of consuming more than we produce. But I like to think that I can tip, like you suggested, like, tip the scales at least a little bit in the other direction, right?
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing that, no author or creator or podcaster, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, you can ignore it, is the other part of it that's validating is when you connect with some, like two things. One is when like your audience just like tells you something was great. That's always a good feeling, right? People want their stuff to be liked. But the other thing that's cool, I don't know if you've experienced this at all, but I find that people I never would have met at any other moment in human history, I can suddenly connect with. And the thing that brings us together is something I've created.
Yeah.
And that's very cool. Like it's very, we are in an era where I had a student from Singapore write me like a handwritten note a couple days ago. And I remember just thinking like he had read the book, we had connected over Twitter. Then he had asked me for my address to send me something. I had sent it to him. He had sent it to me. And like at no other moment in human history would that have been possible.
Yeah.
I find that to be the other part of it that's really, it's very validating because the thing, it's not just like producing, because anybody could produce, you could produce in a Google Doc, right?
Yeah.
And not have it ever see the light of day. But producing and then kind of shipping or publishing or exporting or broadcasting or putting your episodes available for download, it puts you into collision with all of these like crazily interesting people, right? And so I do find like that's a big part of it for me now is I get energy from those people. I listen. I want to hear what in the book resonated for them. I'm sure your podcast is similar.
It is, but for me, I find it on a more happenstance for the content creation part. I use Twitter and the random algorithm of it, I guess, as a way to get guests that have either never been on a show before or who I'm just meeting or seeing in the ether for the first time. And it's like, oh, because, there's occasions where, after a recording, somebody would be like, so that was fun, but like, why me? And I'll be like, oh, well, I just saw a tweet and I thought I'd ask, right? Like it's that simple. And if I wasn't looking at Twitter or they hadn't tweeted the thing or it didn't come into my algorithm or whatever, I never would have asked them. And so now I have these relationships that I wouldn't have otherwise had. And it's just like, oh, but I took the chance. And I was like, yeah, why not? Because I'm not.
Yeah.
I think part of it, I want to help tell a story of some kind, whatever it is. And so I don't need to get the most famous person and I don't need to get the no name. And if I get anything in between there, it's perfect. Like I'm okay with that. Like as long as you can talk to me, we're good. Yeah. Like we're golden. So I've had a lot of people on my show that I've been their first podcast. I may still be their only podcast, right? Because nobody else, it's just a random person on the internet that's like, I'm interested in your story. Would you come over on my show and talk about it? Like, and it's just that simple where it's like, yeah, I mean, look, I still like hearing from my audience, but for me, it's that extra piece of like, I just gave this person a platform. They never had one before. And, and I know going in, I have to do a lot more legwork. If you're not like you've spoken, you've been a speaker. It's not necessarily part of being an author, but now I think it kind of goes part and parcel. But I've had people that I know were uncomfortable. Like they were happy for the opportunity, but they were like, what am I doing here? Like and
that's great.
I don't mind that. Like I know it's more work on my behalf. Like I have to carry the conversation a little bit more. They're less likely to say, okay, and what about you? Right? Like it's just but at the same time, like I'm okay with it. And it kind of adds to it's something else. Right. And I got that from Mark Maron because one of the things I noticed was he always has a fairly elevated celebrity status on his show, right? Whether it's in art or music or, anything, like most of those people have done something. Right. But what I learned was as a listener, I learned more from the people who I didn't know beforehand. Right. Like, okay. Like I'm really excited because he has like so-and-so on and I know them. Like he had Slash on and I was a big Guns N' Roses fan, like growing up. Right. Like that's cool. But he had a no-name blues guitarist on that I learned more from because I didn't know them. I didn't know their story. And so for me, it's all about like, well, how can I do that on a smaller level? Like giving people a platform that wouldn't otherwise have a platform. And I'm going to learn something. I mean, that's the other thing is
Yeah, that's true. We get the benefit of like actually learning the part of it that sort of fires all the dopamine receptors
It,
in the brain.
it really does. And so like I enjoy that part of it too, but
Yeah.
I will say like I try not to have the same conversation all the time as well.
Uh,
And so there's a balance there, right? I can't just, cuz when I was first starting this show, the blog had existed and I had people that were like, "Well, why
mm,
don't you just talk to authors?" Cuz in my circle, I'm one of the few people that is reviewing books. Like
right.
I'm not the only reader, but there aren't a
Right.
lot of people that are like taking the time to read a book and then actually
Yeah.
write about it. And I was
Yeah.
like, look, I will have authors on my show. Like I want to be able to
Right.
give them a platform, but I'm not just going to talk to authors
To authors.
because I
Right.
don't want to get into a habit where I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I do ask every author, like, why do you do it? Because to me,
Yeah.
it's not an easy road. Like, I
Right.
feel
No,
like
it's not.
more
It's
than
the opposite.
almost any other profession, it's the one that's the most amount of work for the most amount of chaos, is what I'll call it. Because maybe the book will be great. Maybe it won't. Maybe you'll get a second chance. Will the second chance work? Like, there's so many X factors in it. I don't know. Like, I'm the master of my own domain. Like, I hit
Right.
publish and I pay the bills for the hosting of the blog and the podcast. I don't have to worry about
Yeah.
a bad show or a bad
Right.
blog. Like I do because
Right.
I want my standards to be high and I always want to make it like accessible and you know, either educational, entertaining, or informational. But you have a little bit more writing on it. Like the next one is very much potentially hanging on this one, right?
Yeah. Yes, and um, I mean, you say that, I'm like, maybe I should give up books and do podcasts. but I no, I would say yes, and also, you know, I think that there are. It's interesting to like think about that there's so much riding on it. I think that what in my case, I feel that there's a lot riding on like an individual project as a self-contained thing.
Okay.
Meaning I do feel the risk and I'm like, oh, like putting this thing out in the world. What if I got something wrong? All that stuff. I'm not necessarily thinking about like how one will affect the other.
Okay.
And I think that's partly because of just what I do is not like, I'm not doing sequels of my book over and over and over again. I wrote about Cato the Younger. I wrote about Claude Shannon. I wrote about, Silicon Valley. And so I have this, the advantage I have is I get to pick the next thing that I'm interested in and then apply this same template, meaning that the template of just like ridiculous amounts of hard work and like
Yeah.
a lot of obsession for a number of years. And I don't see the success or failure of one book as necessarily influencing the next.
Okay.
It shapes how I approach it. There are things that I did during the writing of PayPal that I learned while writing The Founders, and I'll apply that to other things. But I don't feel the weightiness of, and I think I may have earlier in my career, but I don't feel the weight of like, oh, it's all or nothing with this book. I will agree though that you're right. It's a little bit nuts. Like the years of investment into something where you don't publish any of it before it comes out, and then you put it out and it like has to work. It's like you're doing like Avatar, right? But without James Cameron's like prior successes, or and that is a little scary. But it's why you have friends and readers and pre-readers and editors and all that stuff.
I mean, now that you've had books come out, does it feel less like, is there less of that now because you are standing on the shoulders of previous books and it's like, I did that, I accomplished that went over well, and now I'm doing this one, and does that help going forward?
No. Here's what I would say. Let me actually answer the question, because I think, particularly people who are listening who are writers or who are trying to do writing or who want to
Yeah.
do this sort of thing. I would say the answer is kind of like, I have to sort of answer it two ways. No, in the following sense, which is, I now have the obligation of an even higher dive the next time, because the people I wrote about are sufficiently big and interesting and sort of like world historic. And so the bar is like elevated now to like choose an even bigger topic. And you sort of have like the question that keeps running around in my head is like, well, who's like bigger than, like Elon Musk, or like, who's like at that same level? You kind of are like, oh, I've got to like pick somebody amazing. That's like the way in which it's not. But I will say that the way that it is I feel more confidence as a writer and as a researcher now. I kind of know what the process will be once I've chosen my topic and gotten my publisher on board. I kind of know what the next, let's say, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, however long a book takes. I know what that looks like now. I'm not groping in the wilderness anymore. I'm actually like, I know exactly what I would start doing, the websites I'd use, the tools I'd use. I have a system, I have, frameworks, Google Docs and all that stuff. So the process is easier, but I would actually say that at the front end, the choice of topic and the choice of like commitment and investment is where the hard part is. At least for the kind of writing that I do. Again, this might be very specific to like narrative, nonfiction, of the variety that I do. You have to be very careful what you sign up for because you're living with it for so long. And so you have to just like really choose very wisely what you end up committing to. And I think that's the part of it where I'm a little scared. Like I like kind of need to pick something that will engage readers and engage me and be sufficiently difficult that I feel like I'm not just like climbing the same mountain again, right? Like to me, the worst thing I could do is like, Founders 2, eBay Strikes Back, or whatever, it's like that would be just awful. I want to not become, like there's a real temptation to just copy yourself over and over again and to like do the same thing over and over again. And I mean, like, that's not the style of work I want to do. I kind of want to just like blow up the script a little and like pick something that nobody expects.
Well, here's the question. How much time did you give yourself between the Claude Shannon book and Founders? And I mean, as we stand right now, Founders came out this year. So how much time are you going to give yourself before the next? I mean, that's 2 questions, but still like,
no, I'd have to look back, but I think it was like a good 6 months to a year. I mean, it might have even been longer than that. And it wasn't as long as it should have been, but it was enough time to get me to like walk away from Shannon a bit and like kind of give myself some breathing room before I start the next one. But the question of there's this period. So here's like a lot of authors will say it's like there's a period right after the book launch where you basically like hate the book and you hate all things related to books in general. So you go through this like 3 to 5 months of like, I'm never doing a book again. Like if we'd done this interview in March of 2022 and you're like, oh, what are you working on next? I'm like, anything but books. I'm never doing a book again. Not going to happen. It's too much for all the reasons you said.
No, I mean, look, so here's the thing, right? I'm helping a friend with a documentary, a full length documentary. And I was talking to a friend of mine and he goes, how's it going? I was like, it's going well. Like, because of the podcast, I was able to help mix a movie. Like who thought I could do that? Right. And I helped produce it by, helping produce shows and this, that, and the other thing. He goes, so would you do it again? And I was like, I don't know. Like it's twofold, right? Like one, I now know, like when we first got into it, we just said, yes, like maybe we can make, you don't know what you've got now, right? Because I know what it entails. Maybe I'd say no, right? Like, and that's, I feel like you have to deal with that in between every book because every book's different, but you're also like, well, I learned a whole lot, but I know what it takes.
I know what it takes. And the thing about it is that, like you do, we're getting into some pretty like deep, like existential and or like therapy type stuff, right? But it makes it more fun. So
that's all that's the creative process, my friend.
Like, is. But if you can imagine, like, it's like one of these, like, and again, I'm not prescribing this to anybody, but like, if you can imagine like waking up at 4:00 in the morning on like a Christmas morning and getting to work on the book before your kid wakes up so that you can get the work done that day and then going back to it like later, that was my life for a number of years. And that's not a complaint. It's not like a woe is me. Yeah. That was just what my process was for this specific book. But I don't think that, given that I know that that's the way it's going to be, that you can never, once you're in it, actually divorce yourself from it. I am very careful, especially at this stage, to say, I'm going to be choosy about what comes next because I'm not farming it out. I'm not outsourcing my research. I'm not like using a team of fake writers, or like writers to like, and putting my name on. I'm not a brand. I'm not like my name, but it's like, oh, 3 other people wrote the book. It is, I know what it requires. And so I'm very careful about it for the same reason it sounds like for the documentary. You're like, I know what this takes and I'm not going to like say yes to any project that comes along.
Yeah. It's weird because in the creative space, people are going to be like, well, you should be creating something. And so, yeah, that's fine. But I mean, given your skill set, you could jump into the newsletter space, which I know you've dabbled in. You could jump into the blog space. You could probably, I mean, you've done the speaking circuits, so you could do the pod. Like there are any number of other avenues if you so want them. Right. And
yeah,
it also leads me to this, which is a dangerous question, but like, how much of this stuff do you have to do? Like, I know you don't have to do my show, but you still have to do press when a book comes out. And, so when a book comes out, you do all that stuff and you've been through the, I guess, well, can I say it? Like you've been through the ringer twice. You've had a book published and you've done all the press. Do you enjoy that part of it? Or is it like, did you adjust to it?
No, I will say I love it.
Okay.
I love it more when it's conversations like this, right? Like 5 minutes, which is like the greatest hits and the goofiest stories is not that fun, right? It's just not because I'm there and you're sort of a circus performer, right? Like, oh, look, the bear is going to stand up and juggle or whatever, right?
Is it
like,
at least fun the first time?
It is fun the first time,
Okay.
just like anything's fun the first time, but then you sort of realize what role you're playing. But an hour and change on the creative process with somebody who's also going through the creative process where we're talking about not just like, the juiciest bits of the book, but where we're actually talking about the struggle to create something new in the face of your own desire to just consume and then how you manage that. This is fun. It's sort of art. It's like elliptically about the book, but it's not really about the book.
Yeah.
Right. I like, if people get excited, and I'm sure this is your view, if people get excited about your work and they want to talk to you about how you do your work, it's a very fun thing to talk about. But that's not the nature of all press that is associated around a book. And so I would say, like, net, I really like it. But I think the other thing that people underestimate is that the most work you do in marketing almost any product is in like the actual product design and development and creation. Meaning, like, word of mouth is a driver of my sales more than anything else. Like, sure, I can do podcasts and I like them, and I can do Q&As and all the rest. But ultimately, like, part of what's driven the success of at least the founders, and I would say to some degree Claude, Shannon, is fans of those topics recommended the book to other fans of those topics. And I need to do some pushing, to get that first little bit of like the wheel turning. Like, you have to overcome that first hurdle.
Yeah.
But the work really happens in the years when you're just struggling to make sure stuff jumps off the page or like sounds right in the ear in your case, though. That's the marketing. Like, the marketing is the actual creation of the product, which, like, I think to some people might sound like a cliche, but it is actually one of those cliches that is true, right? It is the reason that certain companies spend nothing on advertising and others have to spend tens of millions, right? It is genuinely the case that great products take on a virality of their own with a little bit of effort, right? And it doesn't mean you can be foolish. Like, you can't wall yourself off from, I'm not going to do any press. It's going to be so good. Everyone's going to, no, that's like, that's the other extreme.
Yeah.
But I would say that part of what's been nice is that I think very smart people like yourself have like read these books, enjoyed them, and recommended them to other people. And you're not doing it because I'm shilling or paying you or any of that. It's just you happen to really like the subject. I do think that it's one of the things that makes some creative industries like podcasting and books a little different from others, which is they're kind of bathed in generosity, right? There's actually like a very generous spirit within the domains that you and I are in, meaning most people are willing to help other people out along the way, right? So I don't know if all authors are this way, but most authors I meet who are older than me will take time to mentor me and help me out, right? We don't call it mentorship. There's no contract. But Walter Isaacson will take time to like answer emails, talk to me about endnotes, walk me through what he did with Steve Jobs, right? In the same way, I try to make sure that I do that for authors who are kind of on the come up. I imagine podcasting is pretty similar.
I have a mentor, I guess you would say. I email him maybe once a year, and I don't use his name, and I'll never invite him on the show, even though he's a fairly big name. And that's because I want to keep that with me almost, right? Like I can't, I'm not saying they wouldn't come on the show. I'm just never going to ask because I want to keep it that way. And I'm always here. Like I've taken calls, that are just like people that are curious and helped other people out. And I think it's the creative space in general. I mean, a podcast and book is one thing. I think I started watching Twitch and people playing video games. They're always getting bombarded in chat with like, how do you do this? And they always answer the question, which I enjoy. Do they answer the questions I want to hear? No, probably not, because I'm not interested in starting up. I'm interested in why you're doing this, and it's not something else. But I think
you know what I mean to say is like there's less like preciousness about sharing ideas and process in our industries than in some others. I never feel like anything I do is a state secret. People are like, how do you write a book? I'm like, get excited about something, wake up every day, feel miserable for a few hours, do that 7 days a week for 5 years, you'll have a book. It's like, and not everybody necessarily wants to do that. I mean, I don't know how many people would want to like read old emails from the year 2000 on Thanksgiving. It's not that enjoyable for some people. Meaning it doesn't feel like there's like some great secrets that you and I are keeping from other people. There's enough Promethean fire to go around.
No, you're right. I think what's the cliche? Like, you got lucky. Well, I worked really hard to get lucky, right? Like, and that's that thing where it's like, no, like that's not, it was hard. Like I put myself in that position. Like if I didn't work hard, if I didn't, do the editing, like who edits? No, I edit. Like you don't have to, or like when I write the blog and throwing it to another friend for just another pair of eyes, which is, I feel like is important to at least hold myself to a standard, right? Like, there's a lot of work to get lucky and to be found.
Right. And to be fair too, we're sort of like, we did the drudgery part of it. It's also a ton of fun. Like it is the opportunity to like if anybody listening is thinking about diving headlong into some element of their creativity and they haven't necessarily taken the plunge for whatever reason, the thing I can tell you is it's life-changing once you do it. You become a different person on the other side of a creative project, no matter how small it is. And the actual thing that you're doing that I've in my head, the visual is always, or at least the way I think about it is always like the creative project pulls you along as much as you're pushing it along. Right. And so something will happen where you put this thing in the world and you push, make it happen. But it's also kind of like pulling you in the direction of making you a new person. Right. And I don't quite have like probably the brain power at this hour to like really drill down to what that is. But I think it's like one of the most powerful parts of creativity is that you're so shaped by the things you make. And that's really cool. Meaning for anybody, particularly I would say younger people who are like listening, there's real value in like allowing yourself to be shaped by these projects. I built a whole new discipline in my life just around doing this book. Now, could I have done that without the book? Yeah, sure. But like, did it help that I had a deadline, a contract, readers, all this stuff? Certainly. And I went from, it's like sort of like you learn to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Like you learn to do all of these things. You learn that Otter AI is a really good transcription service that doesn't cost as much as some of the others, right? You learn that Google Sheets and Google Docs can be your friend and take away some of the anxiety about losing data. You learn that Scrivener is like a fantastic system for creating raw material for books. These are all things that you get to learn along the way, and it ends up being a ton of fun. So I don't want to make it seem like it's all sort of doom and gloom. There's a lot of upside, and you become a different person, which is a really cool thing.
Content creators, which at this point includes everyone releasing something into the world for others to consume via video, audio, image, text, or any combination thereof, are more and more relying on each other for assistance. Tips for marketing, help with planning, a shoulder to cry on, and people to celebrate with. Sure, each content creator has their own community. This show has listeners, Jimmy's books have readers, but we look to each other because there is an inherent understanding. We both hit publish, just in different ways and at varying frequencies. But as you just heard, the similarities in our processes are only differentiated because of how often we start and finish projects. And we aren't alone. There are fellow podcasters I know, other authors, and content creators whom I enjoy following that also have their own creator communities. While many of us work solo or solo-ish, meaning there could be some helpers, a lot of the work comes down to us and we can all relate to that, with the added benefit that we've all accepted somewhat public roles for our creations, and that means there is an expectation of content that we can also share with others. But no matter what, we're creating things for your enjoyment, but also for ourselves too. Very few people get into creation for the sake of everyone else. That other people enjoy it or want to consume it is usually a wonderful byproduct. And another wonderful byproduct is that, as Jimmy stated, we are shaped as much by the things we make as they are by us. An example of this would be this podcast, specifically how my answer to why do you do this has evolved over the course of the episodes that you have heard it asked. I would guess I've answered the question at least 5 or 6 times during the course of this show so far, and I know that my answer has evolved because I have. Those of you who have been around since the beginning probably already know that, but for those of you that haven't, just know that if you keep listening, I'm sure you'll hear that evolution too. So go on and do the thing. Start that book, podcast, painting, comic, or whatever it is you want to create, and remember that who you are at the start isn't who you will be when you finish. Thanks for listening to The Palmer Files, episode 82. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Jimmy Soni at Jimmy A. Soni, that's JIMMYASONI, and this show at The Palmer Files. You can find more information about Jimmy at jimmysoni.com, that's SONI, where you can also find links to his published works and see his essays and some of his talks. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer, including reviews of Jimmy's books, is agentpalmer.com. All right, Jimmy, do you have one final question for me?
Yeah, let's try this one on precise. And we cannot go down this road if you don't want to go down the road. But one of the things that I and many other people I know who are creative struggle with is like anxiety about the creative process, about the outputs, about being criticized, just anxiety as a big, scary, hairy ball of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what tools or techniques, if any, you use to manage that for yourself.
I suffer from what I will call social anxiety to begin with, which is completely and utterly unrelated to the creative process. I think to answer the question, I have to go back. In high school, I was a creative person, right? I was writing poetry, a few short stories. And in college, I wrote for the school paper and, kind of got out there, right? And you did a few social things, student government and all that stuff. And then I was working in retail for like 7 years and after post-college. And that at that time, somewhere in there is when something snapped and I became riddled with anxiety for socially, right? And I worked through it. And I don't take any medication. I don't necessarily think it's the greatest idea that I don't take medication, but it's my process, right? Like it's how I work through it. And so everything else is super easy by comparison, right? Like if I put out a blog post and somebody's like, "Oh, you misspelled something."
Right.
All right. Well, you read it and I'll change it. Like that's fine. You got something wrong in your podcast. All right. Well, I can't change that, but thanks for listening. Right. And I think that part of it is because of the social anxiety. The other stuff is, so small to be insignificant. However, I will say it wasn't always like that. I think that's me answering this question in 2022, where the blog is 10 years old and the podcast is over 2, maybe 3 years old. I don't pay attention anymore. It's probably 3. But I guess the answer is 10 years ago or 11 or 12 years ago when I started the blog, publish might have been a little bit more anxiety ridden, even given all the other social stuff, because I'm putting something out into the world. But when you have a blog for more than a decade and you've hit published more or less every Thursday for that entire decade, the anxiety starts to go away because you're so used to putting something out there into the world.
Right.
And so any feedback, I'm just thank you for because both of these things are passion projects, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just a thrill that somebody took the time, right? And it doesn't matter if you're my best friend or my father or a stranger, you took the time to listen or you took the time to read. And so in that regard, the anxiety is a lot less. Also, for better or worse, and I do have I guess what you would call a team of editors, right? I have a bunch of friends who I throw drafts to before I hit publish just so somebody else can see it. But it still all lies with me, right? So I don't have a team. If I feel comfortable enough to hit publish on anything, it's met my standard, right? And I know obviously we're all human. Nothing's 100% going to be perfect all the time, especially when you do it weekly for more than a decade, right? Like, of course I got some stuff wrong. And of course there's still misspellings and, but the other part of it is, and this is the important piece, you could still read my first blog post. I've grown. I don't take that shit down. Like that stuff's out there. And it's also for me, a couple of years ago when I had the 10-year, when I wrote about the decade. And it was literally like an offhand comment to my main editor. Chris is one of my best friends. He's my main editor. He edits most of my stuff. And I was like, 10 years is coming up, but I don't know if I'm going to write about it. And he's like, I will come, because he lives about 90 minutes away. It's a drive, it's a haul, but he's like, I will come down there and punch you. You're gonna write about this. Right. And so I think there's also a part of it where it's like, you look back, I did a special thing for 300 posts. Why 300? Why not? Because I missed 250 and I didn't, whatever. But you don't pay attention to milestones until they're there.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big anniversary or celebration guy to begin with. Just in general, because I'm always on to the next thing. I don't want to wait. So I've taken the time occasionally and I look back and I see, maybe the word count's gone up and then gone down and then gone back up and then gone down or average and, or I wrote a lot about, there were a lot of music reviews and there were a lot of book reviews and there were a lot of movie and now it's kind of balanced out or whatever. It changes and it's interesting to follow along. But, if anybody out there who's just hearing this for the first time wants to go back to my blog, you can see the entire revolution. You can pick random pages from 1 to whatever I'm up to now and see what you've done. Yeah.
And that's great. That's amazing. I mean, you built sort of a living archive for yourself, right? You sort of, without unintentionally wrote your own biography through it.
It kind of, and I do wonder too, occasionally I write quote unquote from the desk of Agent Palmer,
Yeah.
right? In order to just write about something that's not consumed or not an event or not something that happened. I don't know. I know there's like, I'm friends with like mommy bloggers who that's what they write about. They write about their life. I write about my life maybe twice a year. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not something I do often, but I think the anxiety for publish diminishes. Like there very much is a diminishing returns with how many times you hit the publish button. And I think that answering the question now, like, yeah, my other anxiety is part of it because it dwarfs anything that the internet can throw at me. You know, when I get heavy breathing and nausea because I'm in a strange place for the first time, I have to find, I have to do my things to get through that. That's nothing compared to accidentally hitting publish on something and being like, oh, oops, I didn't mean to do that yet. Like, let's bring that back. Let's put that back in. I mean, but at the same time, the first publish book, blog, podcast, it doesn't matter. The first one, that's nerve-wracking. The second one, you've been here before. Okay.
You've been here before.
The third, the third one, the fifth one, the 100th one, it's still nerve-wracking, right? Because you're still putting a piece of yourself out there. Like I don't spend years with my projects, but I do spend hours with them, which I guess would be the equivalent.
Well, it adds up.
Right. So
no, it's the same thing, same muscle.
Yeah. And so, there's a part of it that's like, oh man, like I'm still doing, that's the other thing. Like I'm still doing this.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm still, I still get nervous before every podcast. I don't get nervous hitting publish on the blog anymore, but the nerves before this is live to tape basically. Right. But the nerves tell me I should still be doing this. Like the day the day I get on mic and I'm not nervous, I feel like that tells you something. Okay. And I think you should listen. Like, does that mean I need to take time away? Does that mean I need to stop? I don't know. And I think that's for ourselves to figure out. But I'm fascinated by process, and my process has evolved. It's not the same. Like I have one that works, but they all still change. And and I mean, I don't know about your writing process, but I will tell you, like I've turned into a strike while the iron's hot kind of a guy. So I can sit down in a weekend and maybe have 3 good ideas and write 2.5 of them. And then I could go 2 weeks where it's like, I have to write something. What's it going to be? I don't have that inspiration, but you get me that first line and I'm gone. Yeah. I just need the line. Right.
That's amazing. That was an amazing, I'm so glad we went down that rabbit. That was like the best. I mean, yeah.
Well, and
you can cut out my effusive praise after, but that was amazing.
No, well, I could keep it in because I'll tell you this. I get questions about the creative process often enough that just like going back and reading my first blog, I would like you to listen to all of my episodes, but if people ask about the creative process all the time, especially in the one final question, and I always have a different answer because I'm always in a different place, obviously. So like my answers evolved. And if we have this conversation again in a year or 5 years,
which we should,
it'll change. And I think it's part of what you were talking about where like doing the project changes you. Yeah. Well, continuing the project also, it doesn't have to just be like one static project. Like a dynamic or an ongoing project will also change you. So
that's true. That's true.
Yeah. I also don't know to what end, which I guess is it's a massive plus because I don't know where I'm going, but I also don't have an end. So I don't know.
That might be a good thing. The end is itself. I mean, it's the sort of it's not a bad thing to not have an end. It means that your reasons for doing it, the consistency, it has a lot of integrity that way.
And for right now, I'll just keep on keeping on.
Keep it on. That's great.